Ladies and gentlemen, in this Red Gaming Tech.com video we're going to be talking about video game length and just why certain titles now, the big titles, are actually a lot shorter than what they used to be. And we're going to jump in right at the start, I feel, for this one. And by the start I mean the old days. Now you guys may remember the Final Fantasy VII, for example, on the PlayStation 1. You could make the game last you pretty much as long as you wanted. You know, the quick time to complete it was like, you know, maybe 40 hours or so. But you could make it go well over 100 hours, and indeed I did a couple of times because I was maxing out all the stuff. And okay, there are certain games like that now, but honestly speaking, most games now are considerably shorter than the games of back in the day. And this isn't always the case. As I've said, titles like Skyrim are very big. However, often there is a lot of clone brush involved, and by which I mean, if you actually look at a lot of the areas of Skyrim, if you look at a lot of the dungeons, a lot of the foresty areas, that type of thing, there is an awful lot of cloning going on with the same area being repeated over and over and over again. And even if you were to take a look at a lot of the cities, for example on Grand Theft Auto, you can't enter the buildings, for example, and so a lot of the people are walking around are cloned. And although that's not anything particularly new, for example, even the original Tomb Raider on the PlayStation, you know, you would be fighting pretty much the same enemies, and Streets of Rage, for example, the same enemies over and over again. And I don't mean that in a negative way, I just mean that most of the enemies look very similar, or there'd be like, you know, 5 to 10 different types of those enemies, not inclusive of bosses. But now games are becoming increasingly short. Back just a couple of generations ago, the length of games, you know, most of the time was around, you know, 20 hours or so. But a lot of the complaints that people have had right now is the linearity of games. For example, Final Fantasies. And the fact that, quite honestly, the games are very short compared to what they felt they could be. For example, BioShock. Or, you know, why is that? Even Dishonored, for example, I'm just going to have a quick look at my Steam list. Dishonored's not maybe as long as what people thought it might be. The Darkness 2 was definitely quite short. Dead Space 3 isn't that long. Why is that? And to be honest with you, there is no singular reason for it. Certain games are definitely lengthier than others. It obviously depends upon multiple things, and we're going to get into that now. The primary problem with a lot of these is, simply put, obviously one of them is length of story. You don't want to just keep creating content for the sake of padding it. So what I mean now is the games are becoming increasingly narrative driven. Maybe not narrative driven is the long word, but there's a lot more talking, there's a lot more cutscenes, there's a lot more... It's almost like playing an interactive movie now, more than ever. Back a couple of generations ago, sure, we did have some interactivity. Legacy of Kain, for example, which is one of my favourite gaming series ever, it had a lot of interactivity, and Kain would be talking to you throughout the game. He would say X, he'd say Y, but honestly speaking, for quite a large portions of it, you would be just by your lonesome. In other words, you would be alone, you'd be playing, and that would be it. Now, on a lot of the big titles, that's not the case. Now, bear in mind that when we first moved to CDs on the PlayStation 1, developers said, what the heck is going on? We've got so much space. You know, we've got CDs here that, you know, contain 650, 700 megabytes of data, and don't even get me started when they move to DVD. And so we could basically do what we want with this. So what did they do? They did what anyone would do. They'd fill it up with cutscenes. And the problem with that is that, I'll give you a very simple example. Take Final Fantasy VII. One of my discs became damaged. I don't remember which one it was. I think it was the first. It could have been the second, but I'm pretty sure it was the first. And how it would basically work is the game would load, and it would get to the title screen, and I would even be able to load up certain areas of the game, but most of them wouldn't. So, for example, if I tried to go to Midgar, it would not load. If I tried to go to a different area, it would load. For example, the the Chocobo areas and the Chocobo farm would load, and it was a whole thing. So basically what I did was that I cheated. I used the PlayStation 1, opened up the lid, put a bit of blue tack there to hold down the button so that, you know, the PlayStation 4, the lid was constantly closed. Power up the PlayStation, load up the game, swap the disc on the title screen after it loaded or what have you at certain points, and it was cool. After that I could just play the game and carry on, no problem. In other words, the areas were the same. A lot of the space was taken, however, by the cutscenes. However, the actual data of Final Fantasy VII, in other words, the actual space, the actual areas weren't that big, and it would be consequently placed throughout the thing. On the other hand, certain parts of the music, certain cutscenes, well, pretty much all the cutscenes weren't in there, and so what would happen is it would either skip them or play a completely random cutscene, that type of thing. So, the 3 discs mostly on Final Fantasy VII were the ending, the different cutscenes, the theme song, the intros, all of the stuff was basically being taken up by these discs. And now, of course, you know, we're starting to get to the point where this isn't even the case anymore. A lot of the narration, a lot of the story is becoming very tight, and we're not often left alone. In other words, they can't just keep padding out the story. Have you ever watched a movie, or read a book for that matter, and you just thought to yourself, you know, you've been watching this movie for like 2 hours, or even 3, you know, you've just finished it, and you think, what was the whole thing about when they went to the camper van, you know, got all that stuff? It turned out it was completely superfluous to the plot. I just wasted 30 minutes. I could have just skipped those 3 chapters or what have you, and then just, you know, I'd have been none the different. Nothing happened. I didn't even get any scares out of it. Or sometimes, for example, you might have a chase scene or what have you, and it didn't really do anything. You're just watching it, but nothing happens. No one dies, no one, you know, nothing happens. It's just the same storyline, but it's just a bit padded. And honestly speaking, games now, even BioShock, had this problem. You know, certain areas in the middle were very heavily padded. And I'm not talking badly padded, I'm not talking to the point where it became a chore or laborious, but certainly, you know, more padded than what they were. And although I've used this title many times in the past as an example, I just feel it stands up to the test of time. Panzer Dragoon Saga, for example, for the Saturn was really good in the way it delivered narration. That was over 4 discs, but it did so in a very, very awesome way, and it worked because of the rest of the production value for the textures and so on was so much lower, and I'll go into that further in a moment. The other primary benefit for this is that if you were to look at something like BioShock Infinite, you can imagine just how long it actually takes to not only write all the story, but to do all the actual direction, the various writing, the script, the choreography for it. All of this takes a ridiculous amount of time, and much more than what it ever used to, because of the level of detail we're starting to get into now. Moreover, you've also got to look at the production costs for games. Games now are not cheap to produce. Now, I'm not saying they ever were free. I'm not saying they were ever cheap. I'm not saying they were ever, you know, costs nothing. I mean, obviously there are indie games that were done on a shoestring budget, you know, just, you know, you and your friend Jack or whatever, and you just banged it out in your respective bedrooms, and that was it. But honestly speaking, most times, if you're talking about Assassin's Creed, for example, you're talking about Mass Effect or any of these big titles, they are not, you know, just a few pennies. If you start having actors like Patrick Stewart providing the voices for you, or the character likeness, it's going to start running you up a few pennies. For example, Mass Effect had Seth Green in it, had Trisha Helfer in it. These are big voices. You know, they've been in big shows, they've been in movies. They're not going to do this for free. Hence, the production costs goes up significantly, as does the quality of the game, mind you, in terms of the production costs and production value. So you've got that problem, and Mass Effect 2, Mass Effect 1 and 2 and 3, to be honest with you, all had the problems of certain areas being very padded. Planet searching, for example. Now, I'm not saying it was bad, I'm not saying you had to do it, I'm not saying that it was a requisite requirement, it wasn't, you know, needed 100% to complete the game, but if you wanted everything, you have to do it, and often RPGs do this type of thing, and that's cool, it's fine, I don't mind it. But honestly, in games now, it's becoming a very, very standard to do this to a much greater degree. And once again, you're going to notice a lot of clone brush in there. Now, the other problem that we're going to start seeing, of course, are graphics. And graphics and engines and programmers are becoming very, very, very important and critical roles. It was a time when engines could just be programmed by one or two people. Now it requires an absolute literal team of them. And one of the problems we've got this particular moment is the PS3 and Xbox 360, although are roughly even in terms of their specifications, it turns out that they're very different to program for. And then you've got the PC as well, and then possibly the Wii U or whatever. And so, because you've got all these different platforms, it becomes increasingly difficult to make sure that it all works and nothing dies and nothing falls over. So, because of all of this, there's the other problem. The graphics that we expect as gamers, we expect that much better fidelity, we expect that much more level of depth, we expect that much more prettiness, if you will. The problem as well, and I think it's a very valid point that a lot of people have been saying for now, is that games like Mass Effect 3, and I don't know why I keep picking on it, Dead Space, and various other titles as well, Crysis for example. Far Cry is a very good example, Far Cry 3. Far Cry 3, it looks amazing. I don't care what you tell me, I don't care how you would argue it. You cannot tell me that Far Cry 3 does not look visually impressive, especially on PC, on higher settings. At 1080p on absolute max settings with a decent level of anti-aliasing, the game looks amazing. I'm not saying it looks as good as it could, I'm saying that it does look very impressive indeed. However, there are still annoyances in the game, such as grass that sticks through vehicles. I'm sure that's still there, actually. I know there have been a set of updates, but I don't think they've fixed that yet. And it's by no means least the only game that does this. There's tons of glitching and popping up and whatever in games, and to be honest with you, it's really irritating. But for the most part, to create those games, it's a lot easier to create short videos, trailers, or even, for example, box art on games. Because how many people you know just go into the store and just say, hey, the game looked cool, and bought it. My uncle, for example, I know that's a bit of an odd example, but he's far older than me. But he owns a PlayStation 3, and he just goes into whatever local store, and he says, hey, this game looked cool, I'm going to pick it up and buy it. And obviously certain games he does know about, but most of the time he just says, it looks cool, buy it, why not? And I've got other friends who are like that as well. They don't really know that much about gaming. They just say, this game looks awesome, it got pretty graphics, or the box art was cool, whatever. And they just pick the game up. In other words, box art sells a hell of a lot better, and by box art I also mean the screenshots, sell a hell of a lot easier than extra game content. In other words, 2 or 3 hours. In other words, that's why the graphics are often the #1 priority for developers. And I don't necessarily agree with this perspective, but I can understand the perspective. They look at it this way. Let's say we can get a game, let's say you develop a game for 12 hours long, and I just use the word 12 hours just because. Let's say 12 hours long. You develop a game and you spend most of your money on the graphics, on the storyline and everything else, but not really that much on the length. It's certainly long enough to make it so that it's not to the point where people are going to complain over the length, but it just about. And then you know that you can sell DLC. And another reason that DLC exists, by the way, is because of the price of the production of the game. The various assets in their game, for example, the textures that you would see on the ground, often repetitive textures, the characters, the voice acting, the battle cries, the spell effects, if there's spells in the game, or the gun effects, or whatever it is, the weather, the everything that goes into making that game are assets. And if you can make another 3, 4, whatever hours out of that game by simply releasing a piece of DLC that's going to cost them, I don't know, a very small amount in comparison to the game itself to produce, that's the reason they released the DLC. And once again, I'm not going to turn this video into DLC rants, I'll probably do that in another video. But honestly, I don't have a problem with DLC, for the most part. There are exceptions to the rule, microtransactions, for example, in Dead Space, in my opinion, were taking the absolute piss. That's not to say that I dislike Dead Space 3, I quite like the game, but the microtransactions were really taking the piss, and if, for example, I was to spend £8, I'll just use that figure arbitrarily, and with that figure I was to buy 8 hours, 5 hours, 4 hours, for example, of gameplay, and let's say it's an entire new storyline, you know, I might say to myself, it was alright, you know, it wasn't fantastic, but it was worth, you know, the money. At the end of the day, I got to see more of the game. What I don't like, however, is when you have to start paying more for the final endings or, you know, microtransactions, but that's a different topic. But games now are becoming increasingly complicated, and that's why, really, to be honest with you, they are becoming so short. And not all the time. Obviously, there are exceptions, as I said. Skyrim is one exception to the rule. Mass Effect is fairly lengthy. It does have some parts to pad it. The Witcher 2, for example, is fairly lengthy again. Obviously, you've got titles like Torchlight, which is pretty damn big. The problem is with Torchlight and Diablo, and even quite a lot of areas in World of Warcraft, is the, well, you guessed it, the clone stamp has been there, hasn't it? Yes, it has. While we're not looking, it's there and it's weaving its magic. But to be fair, even Far Cry, it's a decent length, by the way. It has a lot of repetition there. If you were to really, really carefully study every inch of that island, I can guarantee that quite a bit of it is foliage, quite a bit of it is parts you can't go past, that type of thing. In other words, it's sections of the game that are completely useless and you're just traipsing from one area to the other. That's not to say that you can't use the quick travel, but I'm just saying that it is there to lengthen the game artificially. And that's cool, I don't have a problem with that, I just merely pointed out. I don't want, you know, to come across like I hate modern games or I expect all games to be 50 hours plus, because that isn't realistic and certain games just don't suit long storylines. Sandbox titles, for example, Just Cause, you can make them last as long as you want. I own, I don't even know what version of Grand Theft Auto I own dozens of them, well not dozens, but I own quite a few of them actually. And honestly speaking, I don't think I've played that many of them that much. I own I own 4, I own the Liberty City Stories, and I own some of the other ones as well on various consoles. But most of the time I just go into dicking around mode. Infamous is one of the very few sandbox games I've actually completed all the way through. But that's just because the story in that was absolute kick-ass. I really did like it, by the way. So yeah, if you've not played Infamous, I'd highly recommend you give it a shot. And I'd also highly recommend that you try it as good first then bad, by the way. Crisis, you know, same thing. The earlier Crisis games had a lot of clone brush in them, but you could also do an immense amount of ridiculous dicking around in Crisis. I don't know if you guys have ever done this in Crisis 1 or Warhead, but you could do silly things like go around the island, try and collect a bunch of barrels, for example, stack them up on top of each other, get the cars, stack those as well. And yes, you could use the builder to do this whole thing for you if you're in the PC version, which I do. But you know what, it's just more fun to just annoy people as well. Lure in a group of enemy soldiers, and then they go in the middle of it, start using the vehicles for cover, you shoot a grenade in there and just watch as basically half the island explodes. It's just fun. So yeah, I mean, that's really why we're seeing the games being shorter now. It's just because of the difficulty of actually creating the graphics and everything else to this quality of that size of that area. Another thing as well to think about is that, honestly speaking, we're also seeing other areas of games being really short-coded. And obviously we're starting to see glitches and stuff in games. Well, we've always seen glitches in games. It's not particularly new. It's not really amazing, it's not astounding, but they're definitely becoming more and more frequent. Why? Because once again, as games become more complicated, more lines of code equals a lot harder. I don't know if you guys have ever created a web page or you've written a Word document. Okay, here's a challenge for you. Look at any essays or any web pages you've created or whatever and try to find a specific issue with that. In other words, one sentence that doesn't quite work or whatever reason, and you'll be there for quite a while if it's a long document. If it's a short document, you're going to quickly notice it. Like, for example, if you see a typo in your Facebook post you're just about to do, you know, there's a good chance you'll be able to correct it really easily. For example, 2 ands in a row or whatever. But in a long-ass document, it's going to take you a while, and it's also very difficult to easily correct that in most applications, especially weird typos. So what I'm basically saying is that that's a problem, but also physics and other items that should be in the game. For example, artificial intelligence is being held back for quite a while, and that's not just because of the length of time it takes to develop a game. One of the problems that we're seeing is because of current generation consoles are basically held together by duct tape at this point in terms of the specifications, that it takes so long to compact all this data onto the PS3 or whatever, that honestly speaking, they have to make changes, they have to make cuts, and therefore they can't make artificial intelligence as good as they would like. They don't have the CPU cycles or the memory to do it. And that's the same with physics, by the way. Physics, I think, is very important. I know I bang on about physics a lot. I know some of you guys might hate the word by now, physics. But honestly speaking, I think that physics is one of the most important things, because it's not just about how objects fall to the ground. It's about how bullets affect an enemy. It's about how grass moves. It's about how smoke moves. It's about water. It's about fluid. It's about cloth. It's about everything. And all of these different things really need to be refined. They're nowhere near as good as they could be. But, you know, that's another limitation of hardware as well. So I think as we move on to better technology, certainly, for example, if you were to look at the new Unreal Elemental demo, that's a very good indication of what we're going to be seeing. The engine does a lot more work easily for you, which is obviously a huge bonus. Anyway, I could make this video a lot lengthier. There are dozens of other reasons because of the length of games are becoming shorter, but mostly it's just down to development time now. It's just about the teams are becoming so much bigger to produce the games, and generally speaking, it's either that, you know, it becomes cost inefficient. You know, they have to do an assessment. How many copies of this game will sell ultimately? You know, they will calculate how many millions of units this game will shift. They calculate that, you know what, we have to sell this amount of units to break even, and if the game dies, and if it bombs because it's not popular, well, they lose a lot of money. And the other problem, of course, is that if it's very heavily story driven, you can only stretch out a story so much before people say, this is just taking the piss. How many times can the princess be in the other castle? How many times do I honestly have to travel the entire length of this bloody game world again just to get a power up, just to go back? And there is no fast travel. This is not fun. You know, there has to be padding for the sake of padding. Sucks. And honestly speaking, there are certain games that I'd much rather, for example, Another World. Another World was packed onto the cartridge of a Genesis or even the Amiga. But honestly, Another World, by the way, is extremely old now, but still, it's well worth playing. It's not a very long game. Once you know the puzzles, once you know where to shoot, once you know where to go, it's not that long at all. Same as Flashback, for example. But honestly speaking, they are incredibly fun. And it's one of those titles where it doesn't really need to be that long. It just is awesome because it's the gameplay experience, and that doesn't even have that much story in comparison to what I felt it could do. Another World, a re-release of it. By a re-release, I mean like a proper version now, would be absolutely incredible if it was done right. And that's another reason that Final Fantasy VII, in many people's opinions, hasn't been made yet. I'm talking about the remake. A lot of people say that, you know, Square are just holding out or being stingy, or you know, they just whatever. Honestly though, Square have lost some money recently, and okay, if they re-release Final Fantasy VII, it would undoubtedly sell well. The problem is, look at Final Fantasy VII, look at the size of Final Fantasy VII. Honestly, just look at the size of it in terms of the areas. If you happen to have a guide available or whatever, you know, that'd be fantastic. But other than that, you know, you could just use your memory if you played the game. And honestly, just think about all the different Marco reactors you went through, the Midgar slums, the Chocobo racing, you know, fighting Emerald Weapon, the sunken ship, the Temple of the Ancients, all of those areas. Think how many there actually were, and then think about the world map, which you are completely utterly free to explore. Wherever you would like to go, you could explore this sucker. Now, obviously there were limitations and everything, but generally speaking, you could go wherever you wanted, especially if you had the airship, or you had the Golden Chocobo. You could basically go wherever you wanted, and of course you needed that to be able to get knights to the round. So yeah, imagine recreating that with graphics now that we would be happy with. And then of course you've got other tricky questions like, do I give voice acting to these characters? And I suppose you could argue that now people know what Sephiroth sounds like, people know what Cloud sounds like, because we've already seen the movies anyway. You know, we've seen Advent Children, or we've heard them in Kingdom Hearts, so let's even ignore that. Let's just talk about the pure graphics of actually the difficulty of recreating all of that. It would have to be heavily clone stamped. It would have to be. So they're probably going to want a technology to come along that's going to make it a lot easier to do that. But even so, it's going to be extremely costly to do it. And if that project was to fail on such a lengthy project, you can imagine how much money that would cost them. And by fail, I don't necessarily mean that it has to tank in sales. Let's say, for example, and I use these figures completely arbitrarily, let's say it needs to sell 1 million units to be able to break even, and it won't do. It would require a hell of a lot more than that. But let's say it does require 1 million. Well, let's say they was to sell 1 million units. Let's say 1 million point 1. So 1,100,000 units. That's basically a very little profit indeed. And they could have released another title that would have cost them a fraction of the cost, and they probably would have made more, which would have cost them less time and everything else. So in reality, it's very difficult for the studios to justify this type of thing. That isn't to say they won't ever release Final Fantasy VII, or re-release Final Fantasy VII. For all we know, they actually are working on it, but it could be for next generation technology when it's going to become a lot easier to do this. Obviously, as technology moves on, the benefit is that the tool sets that program physics, that program, you know, the artificial intelligence and everything else, they are there, but they're a lot easier to tap hold of. Anyway, I'm going to call the video. Hopefully you've enjoyed it somewhat, and I will see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.